Out. It is really my pleasure to have this opportunity to present at the CPC webinar. It's really an honor, since I consider the people and organizations behind the Center for Population Change a reference. So thank you for the invitation. And in today's talk, I will be presenting some work in progress on a research I'm doing in collaboration with Maaike van Dam, who is also at the Center for Demographic Studies in Barcelona, and who is also present today here among the audience. And this is part of a project where we try to contribute to discover patterns and to understand how family life evolves in context of increased union instability. So today I want to show you some preliminary empirical results of these post-separation family trajectories. And I have structured this talk in two parts. In the first part, I want to emphasize how life course approaches can be useful to understand complex relationships between family behaviors and structure post-separation stages. And in the second part, I will emphasize the dynamics in post-separation life courses across countries and over recent decades. So I will start with giving you a brief context to this research, because I assume that you all know that there has been massive change in family dynamics, in behaviors and structures. Just to keep it more nuanced, and if we focus on Western industrialized countries and take as a reference the post-war period with the golden age of marriage and the baby boom, since then, family life courses have gone through a lot of transformation. So life courses were initially highly institutionalized and standardized, with early and stable marriages with many children, and gradually life courses became more diverse and complex, so featuring less people marrying, less children, and the rise of union instability. And this has been interpreted as an erosion of the family due to a number of processes, such as individualization or increasing independence of women. So we observe now more family behavior occurring before or in the absence of marriage. And here there's many research that has been done on cohabitation as a premarital stage or as a substitute to marriage, and also on the substantial growth of childbirth outside marriage. But we're also observing many more family transitions occurring after episodes of union instability. So union instability is not considered anymore the end of family life, but the start of a new chapter or a new stage in an individual's family life course. And in this research, we will focus on trying to understand and see more patterns about these new chapters of family life. So regarding research on post-separation family life courses, this has grown substantially in recent decades. It has been paying attention to a range of demographic and social issues. So we have an important strand of research which is mainly conducted by family demographers, and questions about characteristics and how common are post-separation family dynamics, including different aspects such as repartnering, fertility, and range of living arrangements. And then we have a second important strand of research that focuses on aspects of social inequality and stratification, and has inquired about the role of union dissolution and subsequent family arrangements for growing social inequality. So in this slide, you see that I have not provided any reference to the literature, but these are extensive and prolific literature, especially in the US, but also in many parts of Europe, like the UK. And it has improved much our knowledge about how family evolves after union dissolution and what consequences it has for individuals and for the society as a whole. All right, so despite these great advances, we believe that there are some gaps in the literature that prevent us to understand well some of the key relationships and consequences of family lives after union dissolution. And one of these gaps relates to the fragmentation in the literature. And here I mean that research has often been directed towards specific behaviors or structures, and there has been little cross-fertilization and integration. And related to that, the analytical focus of the bulk of the research is put on point-in-time outcomes, or family transitions and statuses at a given point in time, and often completely isolated from the wider family biography. So we still know little on the potentially complex links across some of these dynamics. And finally, we also feel that most of the research is period and country specific. Well, of course, there are some cross-country analysis, and there are also some cross-period analysis, but analysis that address family change across countries and periods simultaneously are rare, and they generally do not focus on post-separation stages. So we know little about how post-separation life courses evolve in context, which in a way limits how we inform potential intervention. So that's where we come to this study. We try to contribute somewhat to close some of these gaps in knowledge. For that, we examine family trajectories since the dissolution of the first union. And as the first objective, we want to address how family life courses evolve. And for that, our empirical exercise focuses on sets of partnership and fertility episodes over 10 years since the dissolution of the first union. And as a second objective, we want to address how family life courses vary across socio-historical contexts. And for that, we use a double comparative approach where we compare family trajectories across 7 countries and for a range of decades. So one thing to note here is that we focus on women, and the reason is in part practical, because we will not have data for men in all the contexts we address. And possibly the results that we're going to get here might not necessarily extend to men, because we know that post-separation outcomes have traditionally been different for men and women, though possibly it's much less nowadays. So I'll start with the first research objective. This is the first part of this talk today. I want to start by acknowledging that the understanding of union instability and the subsequent family dynamics has really benefited from the combination of the analysis of longitudinal data and the adoption of concepts and methodologies of the life course approach. To date, most of this literature has adopted what we know as a point-in-time perspective to life course. So here the focus is on transition outcomes, investigating the immediate determinants of specific family dynamics. And there is much agreement that this perspective might be appropriate to establish cause-effect relationships, since we have some control about the right time order of events. But more recently, research has been adopting a holistic or long-time perspective to life course, where the focus here is on process outcomes, or entire life trajectories. And these enable us capturing the real experience of individuals as they progress through life, so that we can better understand some of these complex relationships across dynamics over individuals' lives. So just to illustrate what I said, the dominant approach would focus on a transition, and here in this example could be births in higher order unions. And the analysis could inform us about how common this transition is and how it relates to the conditions of divorce. But we find that this approach often fails to acknowledge that there are many possible paths to the same outcomes. So in a way, it's assumed that births in higher order unions may have the same meaning for all individuals, but it might not be necessarily true. It might not necessarily be so for those who had children with a previous partner, or those who are having children in the context of step families, or they are in a single-headed household. So with the holistic approach, we believe that we can tell much more about the relationship among behaviors and structures by focusing on trajectories that combine a range of family outcomes. All right, so there are already some studies, 3 previous studies that adopt this trajectory approach to post-separation life courses. Two of them were conducted in Belgium using the divorce in Flanders study. And the other one was conducted in Germany. I did this work with Lisa Schmidt. In general, results of these studies show that there's quite a lot of diversity in post-divorce life courses, and that this diversity is often related to the socioeconomic conditions and the family arrangements at the time of divorce. So in our research, we will perform similar analysis, but on a wider range of national and temporal contexts, so that we can later on study differences across the socio-historical periods and contexts. So for this analysis, we will use data from the Harmonized Histories datasets, which contains harmonized fertility and partnership histories from a range of surveys for different countries. And this is mainly surveys from the Gender and Generations program. These datasets were harmonized by Brianna Pirelli-Harry and her international collaborators. And for this analysis, we selected 7 countries, including the UK and different temporal contexts, or what we label as union dissolution cohorts between the 1970s and the 2000s. So that way we have a diversity in socio-historical contexts with regards to the diffusion of union instability and new family forms. So other countries in the study are France, Netherlands, Poland, Russia, Spain, and Sweden. And our sample consists of women who were born between 1930 and 1984, who experienced the dissolution of a union, which could have been cohabiting or marital, and the union ended before they turned 40, so that we can actually follow their post-separation trajectories during prime ages of family formation. And to build our measure of family trajectories, we use the retrospective information on all past union and birth episodes that are reported by each respondent. And we conceive family trajectories as state sequences, which are successions of categorical family states. You can see this bar here. This is an example of a fictional sequence for the family trajectory of an individual, and starts at the month the union was dissolved. And here you have 120 boxes for the family states each month for over 10 years. So as you can see here, there are different colors which represent different family states, and changes in colors represents a family transition. So in this example, you can see that the individual repartners few months after the separation, has a child a couple of years later, and then about 7 or 8 years later, so dissolves this union. So as you can see, the family states are multidimensional because they combine partnership states, which could be being partnered or unpartnered, with childbirths or childbearing states, which could be no birth, first birth, or second birth. And we come up with 5 possible family states that are relevant enough in our sample and reflect a simplified but also quite relevant set of post-separation family situations. So by analyzing these sequences, we want to establish evidence about how family life courses evolve after union dissolution. And for that, we use algorithmic methods, basically sequence analysis and cluster analysis, to reduce the information contained in all the sequences of this, that we have in our sample, so that we can establish a typology of trajectory pathways. And to establish this typology, we follow a 2-step procedure. The first step is to assess the similarity across each pair of sequences using an algorithm that is called optimal matching. And then we group the sequences by their similarity using cluster analysis. But of course, you may wonder, okay, but how 2 sequences are similar here? How do we define similarity? What do we mean by similarity? It could be similarity in the timing, in the duration, in the occurrence, or the order of the states in the sequences. Right. So for this application, what we do is that we define similarity based on the occurrence and the ordering of family episodes. So let's say that two sequences are going to be more alike if we observe that in the two sequences, the same state episodes are observed, and they are observed in the same order. And the reason for that is that we believe that the relevant variation in post-separation life courses is based on sets of transitions that are experienced. And for you to have a feeling of how this similarity measure works, here we have two sequences which display the same state episodes and in the same order. So the normalized similarity score is 1. It's our maximum score. It's just the same. It's similarity, perfect similarity. So here we have we are comparing the sequence 1 again against a new sequence 3, which is almost identical, except that now we find that this union dissolved here. This we can observe in this light blue here. And this is reflected in a normalized similarity score of 0.9, so it's lower, which suggests that there are some differences among the two sequences. And in the last example, we see more differences across the two sequences that we're comparing, and this is reflected in a lower normalized similarity value. So that now that we know what we're comparing, what we do is cluster sequences according to their similarity, and we decide here to keep 7 clusters that summarize a big deal of the heterogeneity in our sequence data. And we have divided the resulting pathways into groups for interpretation. So one is composed, one of the groups is composed by 3 pathways that we label dominant. We find that they are dominant in terms of population distribution. So altogether, they comprise 80% of all sample individuals. And each of these 3 pathways comprise at least 20% of the overall sample. So these pathways are characterized either by low complexity or fewer family transitions in separation, or by a standard or normative sets of transitions, such as forming a stable partnership or a family. All right. On the other hand, we have the marginal pathways here on my right, which comprise only 20% of sequences in the sample altogether. And each of these 4 marginal patterns comprises less than 10% of the sample. So these patterns are highly complex, so with many family transitions, and all of them feature family instability in post-separation family life. So one of the first conclusions that we can extract is that the fact that the dominant patterns are more stable or less complex suggests that the experience of union dissolution does not equate with highly unstable family lives, at least after the dissolution of the first union. So, as I said, this is one of the main overall conclusions of this, but now I'll give you some more details on each of these specific patterns, but I'm going to go rather quick because I prefer to use the time that I have to present the findings of the second section on socio-historical context variation. All right, so first of all, mention here that this illustration that you see here is a representation of the individual sequences that have been clustered together, resulting in this pathway. This pathway is one of the dominant pathways, and we have labeled it as a stable repartnering because it features repartnering sometime after union dissolution, no disruption of the new partnership, at least by the end of the observation window, and additionally, there is no childbirth, so there is no fertility here observed. So about 1 in 5 individuals in our sample follow these pathways, and this is more often among those who were young and married at the time they dissolved the union. So in a way, this pathway displays how union dissolution can be at odds with further childbearing, as it does our most dominant pathway, which is the no family pathway. And as you can see here, this figure is completely yellow. because the individuals are not experiencing any family events. This is the largest pathway in our sample. It's about 1 in 3 individuals, and it's most likely among individuals who were older at separation, with higher levels of education, unmarried, and with children. And of course, this pathway is also more typical in earlier periods. So when union instability was not commonplace, or it was kind of more selective, and particularly in countries such as Poland and Spain. And this is the last of our dominant pathways, comprises 1 in 4 individuals. It's kind of the opposite to the previous one because it features many transitions. We observe here repartnering, partnership stability, and 1 or more children with this new partner. In contrast to the previous pathway, this is more common with lower ages, marriage, childlessness at union dissolution, and it is more common in recent periods and in countries such as Sweden, which is one of the forerunners in the diffusion of union instability. All right, so it remains these 4 marginal pathways. This that I'm showing here features childbearing outside a partnership, and only few individuals repartnering eventually. This is mostly related to low levels of education and low wages at union dissolution, and it is more common in recent periods and in countries such as the UK or France. Then we have a pattern of multiple or serial relationships featuring 2 or more partnerships after the dissolution of the first union. And this pattern relates to low ages and childlessness upon union dissolution. Then we have a pathway of unstable repartnering, which is different to the previous one in that we only observe 1 short-lived partnership episode instead of multiple. And most of the time, women here remain unpartnered. And finally, there is this very small group that features early repartnering and childbearing after the dissolution of the first union, but this new partnership will not last long. So just very briefly, and as a summary to conclude this section of the presentation, here I have proposed a trajectory approach to represent family lives as lived. I have used sequences as analytical units, and one of the key advantages of sequences is that they encompass multiple family behaviors and structures. And combined with algorithmic methods, we can more effectively identify structures or patterns of family dynamics that capture most variation in family life courses. In the empirical application I show you, in this simple empirical application, we have identified some relevant patterns, such as that stable family formation and absence of family are dominant patterns among those who separate. And also that family instability appears in many different ways, but overall, these are rather marginal pathways. So in general, we can say that those who separate do not necessarily enter a cycle of family instability. So we believe that our evidence is useful to point out the specific configurations of family episodes after separation, and this can inform research using causal approaches for further examination of more local dynamics in individual life courses. So now I'm just going to move. I hope I was not too quick on that, and I'm now going to move to the next and last part of this talk, where I will look into socio-historical trends in these post-separation life courses. So the socio-historical context is considered as the unit where family change can be observed. And this is defined along 2 axes. On the one hand, the national context, and on the other hand, the temporal context, for us, the union dissolution cohort. The idea is that in a given socio-historical context, women will have a wider or a more limited set of opportunities for family behavior. So to theoretically frame this, and I'm not going to extend on that, we use the theory of conjunctural action, which has been proposed to explain changes in family demography over time. It is useful to us because it enables integrating ideas of traditional frames that consider the role of ideological and material dimensions that underlie transformations in family demography, but it is not restricted to ideas of unilinear change across countries, but also considers within country dynamics and inequalities which might lead to persistence or country-specific change. So in relation to that, we will propose two general expectations on the directions of change. We propose that change can be universal or in the same direction, meaning that countries will follow the same over time trend. And this would be due to common developments in opportunity structures that might be due to individualization or increasing resources among women, as it would be predicted by second demographic transition theory and so on. Still, differences across countries within the same periods would be expected because this would reflect lacks in the diffusion of union instability, for instance. And on the other hand, we propose that countries do not behave in the same direction. So that is to say that mechanisms of change are not necessarily exogenous, but could also be endogenous. All right, so, okay. So there is little doubt, and I think that most of us agree that family change has occurred, but the literature has not always been very clear about what exactly changes and how we should measure that. But luckily, Bruckner and Maya and some others conceptualize key dimensions in life course change, and others have developed measures for these concepts. And here we will focus on two of these key dimensions of change. On the one hand, we will use the ideas of life course standardization. And by that, we mean that over time, less people will follow what is considered a standard trajectory. So this idea of the standardization can be assessed using measures of diversity in life courses, which emphasize variation across individuals. And the second concept that we will address is life course differentiation, which refers to the idea of how often an individual experiences family transitions or changes in family states over lifetime. So the more changes, the more within individual variation or complexity in a person's life course. We will also address how these changes in complexity and diversity translates into variations in the distributions of the typology pathways I have shown you before, because these pathways already combine both aspects, the diversity and the complexity in life courses. So now that we have an idea of what are we going to measure in change, we can set the empirical expectations on the overtime trends. So evidence for universal change can be in the form of increased diversity, increased complexity, and a wider range of more complex trajectory pathways in recent periods across all countries. And in contrast, if we observe country-specific trends in diversity, complexity, and in the change in trajectory pathways, then our evidence will be more suggestive of country-specific dynamics. So in relation to these expectations, we should note that to properly assess universal change, we need to attend to the fact that there are differences in the emergence and the speed of diffusion of family change across countries. And in relation to union instability, in our sample, we have 3 countries that can be considered forerunners. These are the UK, Sweden, and Russia. So in these countries, divorce rates rose already in the late 60s and early 70s. And for the other countries, took some more time, especially for Poland and Spain. So we can expect here a lag in the dynamics of change in post-separation life courses. In relation to that, and to better guide our interpretation of context heterogeneity, we have generated an index to capture opportunities for family life in post-separation stages. But this is a work in progress, and so far we account for 2 main aspects. One of them is the diffusion of union instability. So here we consider the prevalence of union dissolution, but also the age variance and whether there is educational gradient in union dissolution, so that we can capture how widespread are unstable family lives in each context. And we in line with perspectives that consider that women's independence from family matters, we also consider this second aspect of women's support in a given context, which includes dimensions such as state income support, work-life balance, labor market participation, and family ideology. So if we see how this index look like in the different countries and for the different periods, this is here in practical terms even more a work in progress, because we lack information on many of the women's support dimensions for a range of periods, particularly those before the 1990s. And for that reason, you cannot see bars for each year in each country. But in brief, what we observe here in the figure is that in some contexts, such as Poland or Spain, women have more restricted opportunities for family because union instability is not so widely diffused, or there is little defamiliarization. And in countries such as Sweden, women had more opportunities as early as in the 1970s. So there are pretty much differences across the countries here. In general, a trend that we see here is that index scores become more positive or less negative over time, especially across those countries that start with lower scores. So if this goes in line with our expectation of universal change or convergence, we would see that most countries might display less diversity and complexity in life courses than Sweden in earlier periods, especially Poland and Spain. But over time, we should see these gaps closing, so smaller differences compared to Sweden. All right, so the empirical analysis, here we use the sequence data that we have derived from the harmonized histories and regression analysis. We will make predictions for measures of complexity and diversity that I will introduce in a second, and also for the distributions across pathways. The key predicting variables are interactions of country and period of separation. So differences in country period coefficients will be used as as evidence for change. And just for you to know, in the models, we also have a range of control variables, such as level of education, age of separation, or other key features at the time of the first union, such as the duration of the first union, whether it was marital union, premarital cohabitation, and childbirth. All right, so first I will show you results on trends of complexity. And for that, I use a measure of the number of transitions that we observe in a sequence, which arguably captures this idea of within sequence heterogeneity. So in this illustration, you can see sequence 1 and sequence 2, and we could consider that sequence 2 is more complex than sequence 1 because there are a higher number of transitions. If we move to the regression results, in these graphs, I'm showing you the coefficients for the interactions of country and period. And I'm helping you now to identify some of the trends with these arrows. So I'm marking in green Spain, Poland, Netherlands, and France, which is what we consider the laggards in the diffusion of union instability. And we observe here that on average, they had lower levels of complexity in the early periods. But over time, complexity in family trajectories increases substantively, peaking in the 90s and stabilizing since then. In contrast, for Russia, Sweden, and the UK, we observe already high levels of complexity since early periods, but no substantive change since then. And if any, it looks like in the 90s or afterwards, levels of complexity might be decreasing, but this is not significant. So it seems in a way that with regards at least to complexity, we have here some signs of convergence. All right, so we move on now to results for diversity. This measure is based on the similarity of each sequence for a period and a country specific to the difference to the most representative sequence, or also known as the method for each country and period group. So imagine that this sequence here, SM, is this representative sequence. So we would use here an optimal matching algorithm to calculate how similar is to all other sequences in the same country and period. And in this illustration, we can see that we could see that sequence 2 is more similar to SM than sequence 1 is. So for what matters to us, or what it matters to us, if on average, most sequences in a country period group are very similar to the reference sequence, as S2 is, then we would conclude that there is little diversity in life courses in that context. And then if we move to our results, we observe here that there has been substantive de-standardization or increasing diversity in most countries until the 1990s. And this has been particularly so among the laggards, which started with very low levels of diversity. But we're also observing for the forerunners and for the Netherlands that in recent periods, diversity has been declining. It's perhaps a little bit too early to extract conclusions because these are preliminary results, but one could speculate that perhaps we're observing some patterns of re-standardization in post-separation life courses among these countries that were once already highly de-standardized with higher levels of diversity. So I'm just very quickly moving to the last set of results. So we want to see how these trends of complexity and diversity translate in changes in the pathways I showed you before. And so in part, the substantive increases in diversity and complexity that I have shown you among those countries that we consider the laggards are mainly due to changes in 2 of the dominant pathways, or are related to changes in 2 of the dominant pathways. So first here, we observe this no family pathway, which is zero complex and was dominant in the 1970s. So among the laggards, more than 40% of separated women follow such pattern. And if we focus only in Spain and Poland, it was more than 50% of women. So this pattern has dramatically decreased since the 1970s to date. And in contrast, the other dominant pattern, the stable family formation pathway, which is way more complex, has gained relevance over time among these laggards. But this pathway has not really replaced the no family pattern. It just has gained some relevance. So now we have 2 equally important patterns among the laggards, which suggests that there is now more diversity in post-separation life courses in these countries too. And as you can see also about the forerunners, this stable family pathway was already more established, and there's been little change with one exception. And the exception is the UK, where we are observing declines in stable family formation after union dissolution already in the 1980s. And this is quite interesting because it's a little bit unexpected regarding the thesis of convergence, but also regarding the patterns that we see in all other countries. So finally, if we move to the marginal pathways, here I'm showing you regression results where I have pulled together these 4 sets of complex and unstable family pathways. And you can see here that even pulling them together, they remain marginal. They are in general very marginal. And there has been only slight increases in these marginal pathways, mostly peaking in the 90s and with some stabilization since then. Again, interestingly, the UK shows a trend of increase until the 80s, and then a trend of decrease from the 80s and the 90s, which is also very interesting. The last thing I want to say is that, in fact, changes in these specific marginal pathways have been rather country specific. So here you can observe that the pathway of non-partnered childbearing has been growing in the 80s in France, but more dramatically in the UK. So we have about 15% of women separating in the UK have children without a formal partner after separation. But in contrast, the other pathway that we see below of multiple partnerships has become more important in other countries, in this case, in Spain and Sweden. So very quickly, to summarize what we have seen so far, the first thing is to remind you that the present research innovates by adopting a long-term life course approach combined with a comparative approach. So we try to contribute to understand how family life evolves in context of increased and increasing union dissolution. Results arguably support a trend of convergence. So among the laggards, post-separation life courses are gradually more complex and diverse, peaking in the 90s. And we suggested that this relates to divorce becoming more common and opportunity context becoming increasingly supportive for women's family behavior. Among the forerunners, post-separation life courses have traditionally been and remain complex over time. All right, but we also have some evidence against the idea of convergence. So for instance, the pathways that we have identified are not evenly distributed across countries in recent periods. And perhaps more importantly, an exception here to convergence is the UK, which shows more divergent trends, potentially due to stronger path dependencies, or perhaps this is a data artifact, who knows. Perhaps actually you have some inputs for me, for us, about what might be happening in the UK here, particularly what happens in the 1980s and in the 1990s, when there is a substantive decline in the stability of families formed after union dissolution, that we are actually not observing in other countries where post-separation family lives are becoming more stable, so stable family formation. Of course, any other suggestion is very welcome, given that this is a work in progress and we would rather benefit from comments. Thank you so much.